Direct from our newsroom in Washington, in color, this is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
Few people have had such a wide-reaching and long-lasting effect on the American public as have Walter Cronkite. He was recruited by Edward R. Murrow in 1950 to join CBS News in order to cover the presidential political conventions. He hosted a number of small-scale news shows before he was named anchor of the CBS Evening News in 1962. Cronkite's profession seems to have been cast in stone. He began selling the Kansas City Star on the streets at the age of 9 and was editor of his high school newspaper. After dropping out of the University of Texas, he filled various newspaper and radio spots covering sports and local news before he joined the United Press as a World War II correspondent.
He was a man of truly unquestionable patriotism and a moral compass that gave him an unwavering sense of duty. Cronkite never allowed his opinions to cloud his broadcasting without first alerting viewers that he was stating his opinion. He finished nearly all his broadcasts with the now legendary line of,
"And that's the way it is. Friday, March 6, 1981.
Cronkite was, however, very careful to never finish with his catchphrase when he concluded his broadcast with an opinion. Cronkite became such a familiar figure in the American home that he picked up the nickname Uncle Walter. Walter Cronkite's honest and brave coverage of America's tragedies on the CBS Evening News brought the country through the JFK assassination and the Vietnam War while earning a generation's trust.
You, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
I, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, do solemnly swear.
That you will faithfully.
John Fitzgerald Kennedy was elected in 1961 by an America in desperate need of change and revitalization. JFK was highly regarded for his World War II service and saw America through the Cuban Missile Crisis, space race, and African-American civil rights movement. Kennedy challenged and inspired Americans to rise up and meet their own potential, insisting that America defend worldwide liberty and democracy while putting a man on the moon by the end of the 60s.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Assassinated in 1963 by Lee Harvey Oswald, Kennedy's death left a profound hole in the American identity. However, the idealism that Kennedy evoked did not die with him, for although Kennedy failed to realize his promise, he left a legacy of hope to millions of Americans. The soap opera, As the World Turns, was interrupted on that tragic November morning by a CBS News bulletin to announce the assassination attempt. Americans tuned in mesmerized by the terrifying news Walter Cronkite was relaying to them. Stoically holding back tears and waves of emotion throughout the day, Cronkite reported the horror with an honest and steady gaze that implied both emotion and dignity.
Throughout the morning, he calmly filled in the story, squelched any information that hadn't been verified, and reduced speculation to certainty, until he was handed a dispatch confirming that the President of the United States was indeed dead. He pulled off his glasses, looked at the clock to repeat the time, and seemed to subdue a sun wave of emotion before he continued with the broadcast.
Thought he was going to lose it, but he didn't. I figured, where's Severide? I got to get somebody in there right away, because I didn't know whether Walter was going to recover from it, but pro that he is, he did. But I think that moment, all of America shared that. They all felt what he felt. They felt the same despair. The same, my God, what do we do now? And I think there was probably a tear in 100 million eyes as there was in Walter's.
Cronkite made reference to the fact that Vice President Johnson was expected to be sworn in shortly, a show of courage and optimism that reminded Americans that our great country would endure. Cronkite's reporting remained cool and calm throughout the day as he dispelled rumors and only promoted the fact.
Walter Cronkite's calm and stoic reporting was a show of dignity that America never forgot. As a result, Americans awarded Cronkite the honor of allowing him to give us the bad news about our world as well as the good. Walter Cronkite had already earned America's trust with years of reporting the news with an unparalleled integrity, but it was his reporting on the death of JFK that earned him America's hearts.
It was after former Vice President Johnson had been sworn in that the U.S. first mobilized troops in Vietnam. The United States quickly found itself locked in a complicated standoff as democratic and communist world superpowers fought a symbolic war over the fate of Vietnam. As the year dragged on, the U.S. increased its troop presence to an excess of 200,000. With draft quotas rising, a credibility gap grew between what the media showed and what the government insisted was actually happening.
Criticism of Johnson increased as death tolls and troop requests steadily rose. Anti-war demonstrations became increasingly frequent, and a march on the steps of the Pentagon in October of 1967 led to the arrest of over 680 Americans. During the Vietnamese New Year, the Tet Offensive brought the U.S. intelligence and leadership into question once and for all. During all this, and as the conflict in doubt grew, Walter Cronkite took a trip with a CBS News team to the front lines of Vietnam to get to the bottom of the war.
I decided that I wanted to go and see what I could find out in person.
No one else had the guts to do it.
Walter Cronkite returned from Vietnam at the beginning of 1968 with an opinion on the conflict cemented in his mind. Cronkite had seen the jungles getting gassed with herbicides, seen the Viet Cong outmaneuver Americans, and had seen local and international support for the war plummet. Vietnam was the first real media war, and so ushered in an era in which the public became used to seeing and identifying with trusted television reporters and news anchors. Knowing his opinion would be highly valued, Cronkite felt morally obligated to share his beliefs with his viewers. After receiving the okay from his bosses, he wrote out an editorial to be read at the end of his broadcast on February 27, 1968. He told the audience that the following was his opinion and was not fact. Then he said,
It seems now more certain than ever that the bloody experience of Vietnam is to end in a stalemate. This summer's almost certain standoff will either end in real give and take negotiations or terrible escalation. And for every means we have to escalate, the enemy can match us. And that applies to invasion of the North, the use of nuclear weapons, or the mere commitment of 100 or 200 or 300,000 more American troops to the battle.
Common sense of Cronkite's opinion struck the public. The Viet Cong had no intention of giving up, and the United States had no intention to stay in Vietnam forever. The U.S. had tried to preserve freedom, and that was enough. People with President Johnson at the time he saw the broadcast have quoted him as saying, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America," referring to the evaporation of any remaining support the war might have had. In response to accusations of being unpatriotic, Cronkite wrote, "Patriotism simply cannot be defined." Many of those against the war protested with the most dedicated patriotism and the total conviction that the war was not a just one and was besmirching the image of the nation they loved. Cronkite determined it his civil and patriotic duty to let the country know the reality of the war in Vietnam.
That was rather extraordinary news that created quite a lot of talk at the time.
This is Walter Cronkite. Good night.
When LBJ decided not to run for re-election, just about everyone put it down to the influence and power of Cronkite. His integrity and clear judgment gave him tremendous authority, with the old and young, conservative and liberal. The opinions of Cronkite became and embodied the opinions of America. Walter Cronkite's Vietnam editorial stated the unbiased truth about the conflict. As a result of the subsequent fall in support for the war, Lyndon B. Johnson chose not to run for re-election, and Nixon soon began his plan to withdraw troops with honor through the policy of Vietnamization.
For 19 years, Walter Cronkite told America what was going on in the world. His unimpeachable integrity and commitment to the truth earned him America's trust. The country welcomed Cronkite at two of the lowest points in the 20th century, the assassination of JFK and the failure of the Vietnam War, trusting him to tell us the facts while coveting the rare opinion he put forth. Cronkite came to be a personification of his era and became the media figure of his time.
There was a time when a majority of Americans tuned in and watched the evening news broadcasts. So Cronkite had established a reputation as trustworthy, reliable, almost a father figure for a lot of Americans.
His name was so synonymous with trusted news reporting that for a while, anchors in Scandinavia became known as Cronkiters. Upon his retirement in 1981, he was voted as America's most trusted public figure by a national opinion poll. Many people agree that no reporter has matched Cronkite's journalistic integrity. As Americans continue to get more and more of their news from increasingly biased internet news sources, it is more important than ever that we make sure that our sources strive for the reliability and honesty that Walter Cronkite works so tirelessly to impart onto his broadcasts.
This is my last broadcast as the anchorman of the CBS Evening News. For me, it's a moment for which I long have planned, but which nevertheless comes with some sadness. For almost 2 decades, after all, we've been meeting like this in the evenings, and I'll miss that. And that's the way it is. Friday, March 6, 1981.
This has been the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.